What's going on, guys? It's your boy Kenniron here, and today we're coming at you with a Commander deck tech. That's right, I love MTG, I love Commander, and I love making decks to the point where I make more deck lists than I have the actual time or money to build. So, for our Commander, we're running Piper Wright, Publick Reporter. She's a 2-drop, 1 and a blue, human detective, and she's a 1/2. And whenever she deals combat damage to a player, investigate that many times. And whenever you sacrifice a clue, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So when I first saw Piper, I didn't really think too much of her, but I overlooked one key detail, and that is the line of text, investigate that many times. We're going to try and break that line of text as much as we possibly can in this deck. I want to go ahead and preface this before we get into any of the other cards. This isn't going to be some hyper competitive stompy deck. Like, you're not going to just straight up destroy everybody at any table you're running. You're almost guaranteed to get people saying like, oh, that's really interesting. You know, that's a unique commander. I have not seen that before. You're almost guaranteed to have a good time with this deck at any casual table you sit down at. And so that's kind of what this deck is about. How are we winning in this deck? So because we're wanting to break that line of text where we're trying to investigate that many times, by and large, we end up winning more often than not with commander damage. I didn't build this deck to win off of commander damage. I just wanted to make as many clues as possible. But considering that that is the primary win con, and this deck ends up feeling a little bit like a Voltron deck, granted in a very unique way, that means that we need to get into our first category here. First and foremost, the most important thing we need to do is protect Piper. So starting off, we have a whole slew of counter magic here, right? I mean, we are in mono blue. So we are running Counterspell, Arcane Denial, Negate, Reject Imperfection, and Assert Authority. So I don't think Counterspell, Arcane Denial, or Negate need any kind of introduction here. And then Reject Imperfection, it's just a really neat little bit of synergy in this deck, because if you counter something that's mana value 3 or less, so particularly a spot removal spell, you get to proliferate. We like that a lot. And then Assert Authority is a 7-drop counter spell, but not really, because it has affinity for artifacts. So once we get to, like, I don't know, turn 4, turn 5, for this thing just becomes a counterspell. Moving on from the counterspells here, we are running Ripples of Potential and Hydroelectric Specimen as some more instant speed protection. Ripples of Potential is super neat for the reason that you proliferate, and then everything that has a counter put on it this way just phases out. So it's completely protected, you can't interact with it or anything on it, and notably with Piper's ability to put +1 counters on any other creature that you control as well as herself. If you have some open mana available, okay, you know, you want to board wipe here. Well, hold on a second. Let me sacrifice a clue. Give this guy a +1 counter. Sacrifice another clue. Give this guy a +1 counter. Then I'm going to pay 2, and boom, Ripples of Potential. Now all of a sudden, you know, 3, 4 of my guys are phasing out, and this board wipe does not hinder me at all. And then Hydroelectric Specimen, it's a redirect effect, and honestly, it's in here because it's one of our land slots that can also protect Piper, and I don't think he needs much more explanation than that. I mean, he's dual purpose. He's great. So let's move on to some of the more typical Voltron build style cards, and we'll start with Swiftfoot Boots, Champion's Helm, and Curator's Ward. They all give hexproof. That's pretty much the extent of it. With the Champion's Helm, also buffs her up, +2/+2. And then Curator's Ward, it's a bit of a pet card for me. I don't know why, I've just always liked Curator's Ward. I mean, it gives her hexproof, and then if she ever dies, you get a couple of cards off of her. Let's move on to these next 2 cards. Darksteel Plate and Mithril Coat. Both of these give her indestructible. Mithril Coat, notably whenever it enters, it automatically attaches to a creature, which will almost always be Piper. These 2 cards are some of the pricier cards in the deck. This deck is pretty budget friendly. There are a couple of cards that are running to the like $10 to $12 range, but there are other things that you can run in place of these. This is a jumping off point. You change a couple of cards in the deck as you need to, you know, account for your own budget. You don't have to run exactly these cards. And another cool thing about Darksteel Plate and Mithril Coat is that she can end up attacking for free. But speaking of attacking for free, notably her ability doesn't trigger unless she deals combat damage to a player, so we need ways to give her unblockable. So starting off, we have a whole bunch of creatures that can just give her unblockable as an activated ability. We have Canine Mark 1, Martha Jones, Thassa, God of the Sea, Whirler Rogue, and Senator Peacock. So Canine Mark 1, he's pretty solid on curve. Turn 1, drop him. Turn 2, Piper. Turn 3, whoops, good luck blocking Piper. Martha Jones, she synergizes really well in this deck because whenever you sacrifice a clue for any reason at all, her and up to one other target creature can't be blocked this turn. So we already want to be sacrificing clues in this deck, and so it's nice to have a little bit of payoff whenever we do so in the form of unblockable. Thassa, God of the Sea. You get that Scry 1 trigger every turn, so it helps you fixes your draw for turns. Having an indestructible source that can give unblockable, I mean, that's really solid, especially in a deck like this. Now, Whirler Rogue here, he gives us flying bodies on board. Now, his ability says you tap 2 artifacts down and you can give something unblockable. You'll have enough clues that you don't have to worry about tapping down these Thopters. So something that we do struggle with a little bit in this deck is blocking flying creatures. If an opponent is playing Talrand or they're playing a bunch of dragons, that can end up being a little bit of a problem for us. And so having a couple of 1/1 flying chump blockers, that's really solid. If you need some flying blockers, then, boom, there you go. And then Senator Peacock, let me tell you, she looks so devious. Look at her face. So she doesn't give them anything. She just makes all of your artifacts clues in addition to their other types. And that is actually relevant and synergizes really well with a couple of other cards in this deck. It also is another one of those, sacrifice a clue, target creature can't be blocked this turn. Again, we already talked about that with Martha. So next let's get into some cards that as a static ability, they just give Piper unblockable if they're sitting on the board. So one of them is Detective of the Month, and the other is Herald of the Secret Streams. So Detective of the Month really flew under the radar for a lot of people. It is currently 8 cents, and yet it is an auto include in here. Piper is a detective, and if you have the city's blessings, detectives you control can't be blocked. You're always going to get the city's blessing. I'm sorry, if you're not getting the city's blessing, something's going very wrong. And then whenever you draw your second card each turn, you put a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token on board. It's almost as good at populating the field as something like Belladros or Tindershoot Dryad. You can just sit here and draw 2 cards each single turn. That's 5 unblockable 2-power creatures. So somebody's just taking 8 straight to the dome, right off the rip, and that's not including Piper. So this card, man, it puts in some work. Why is it 8 cents? That's wild. And then we move on to Herald of the Secret Streams, which I am so glad it dropped in price. That thing was like $15, $18 or something before the reprint. And for good reason. It goes in any +1 counters deck. Creatures you control with +1 counters can't be blocked. So this is really good. If you want to end up going wide with Piper, you want to start putting +1 counters on all of your other creatures. It also synergizes really well with another card that we'll see later, and I'll bring that up whenever I get to it. But it's one of our alternate win cons, spoiler. But yeah, man, I mean, it's just a good card. And then a couple of more cards that give unblockable to a creature. And these are more of your Voltron build type of cards, right? We have Aqueous Form, and we have Silver Shroud Costume. So they just give one creature unblockable specifically. Aqueous Form is an enchantment. Whenever she attacks, you get to scry 1, and then she just cannot be blocked. And then Silver Shroud Costume is really neat for the reason that it has flash, and whenever it ETBs, you give a creature Shroud until end of turn. Now, do keep in mind that if you give Piper Shroud, you cannot sacrifice clues and put +1 counters on her anymore. But it is what it is. 2-drop protection that also just attaches immediately and gives unblockable and doesn't go away whenever she dies. And it's an uncommon too. I'm just looking at this. It's an uncommon. Wizards, why is it an uncommon? You know, so we've looked at all the ways that she can be protected. We've looked at all the ways that she can get through for damage. Let's look at all the ways we can make that damage even better, huh? So first, let's look at our recurring proliferation effects. We are running Dreamtide Whale, Flux Channeler, and Throne of Geth. So Dreamtide Whale, it does have Vanishing 2, but whenever anybody casts their second spell each single turn, you proliferate. This thing is never going to go away. Now, all of a sudden, you are punishing people for playing multiple spells, and you're doing so indirectly. You know, you're just benefiting off of it. I mean, it puts in some work. And then Flux Channeler, all of our non-creature spells, all of a sudden, they just start proliferating us. That's some good stuff. So let's move on to Throne of Geth. It's a great way, a great alternate way to sacrifice your clues, and notably it does so for free. You know, if you play Piper turn 2, and then turn 3 you play out Throne of Geth, you can swing, she deals damage, you sacrifice the clue with the Throne of Geth, its proliferate effect is on the stack, then Piper's sack a clue effect goes on the stack on top of it. So yeah, 2 mana for an artifact that gives Piper 2+1 counters every single turn for free. I mean, that sounds pretty good to me. Now let's get into a couple of other ways to sacrifice these clues. So we are running Extruder and Clancrafter. Now, Extruder is a 4-drop artifact. What it does is it sacrifices an artifact and you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So you drop this down for 4 mana. All of a sudden you can sacrifice all your clues and give Piper 2 counters apiece for each of those clues. Now all of a sudden you're killing somebody with commander damage. So it has Echo for 4, so you basically have to pay for it twice, but usually either you're to the point in the game where paying that 4 mana just kind of doesn't mean anything to you, or you're at a point in the game where you just want this to drop down and give you a really explosive turn with Piper, taking people out of the game. Now, Clancrafter is a background enchantment, and it's a 2-drop that says commander creatures you own have pay 2, sacrifice an artifact, and put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and draw a card. So like with Extruder, you sacrifice all of them for free, but you get no card draw off of it. But with Clancrafter, you still pay 2 to sacrifice them, you still get the draw off of them, and you get an extra counter on Piper. Next, let's look at Candlestick. So this thing, it's just on theme with the deck. It's a clue, right? It came from the clue set. Gives Piper +1/+1, so it buffs her up. And then whenever she attacks, you get to surveil 2. You know, if you play this on curve, you play Candlestick into Piper, and then equip her turn 3 and start swinging with her. It puts in a lot more work than you would expect. And even if you draw it later in the game, I mean, that's 3 mana, put a +1 counter on her, draw a card. That's not half bad, man. So, I mean, I say it's more of a pet card because it's on theme, but honestly, it does a lot more work than you would expect at first. Next up, let's look at probably the card that puts in the most work as far as buffing Piper in this deck, and it's a staple of Voltron builds. You've seen it before. It's Nettlecyst. It equips for 2. An equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact and each enchantment you control. I mean, you drop it turn 5, turn 6, and you're looking at giving Piper just +8 out of nowhere. Just out of nowhere. Insert John Cena clip here. RKO! Out of nowhere. So moving on, even though we're in mono blue, we do have a couple of ways to give Piper double strike. Now, double strike, all of a sudden she's getting through for double the amount of clues. So what are these cards? You probably, if any of you are fans of Voltron builds, you've probably already guessed Fire Shrieker is on here, but we're also running Gavel of the Righteous. So Fire Shrieker, really simple card, really neat, I love it. Simply gives equipped creature double strike. Now, Gavel of the Righteous, we have to jump through some hoops to get there, but even those hoops are not the worst in the world, okay? So at the beginning of combat on your turn, you put a charge counter on Gavel of the Righteous, and then equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each charge counter on the Gavel. If it has 4 or more counters on it, equipped creature gets double strike. Oh, and it equips for, you can either pay 3 or you can remove a counter from it to equip it. So I know this card might look like it has a lot of hoops for you to jump through, but you gotta keep in mind, we went through earlier all the different ways to proliferate in this deck, but you don't even need the double strike for this card to put in some work. Sometimes those hoops work to your advantage because people are like, he has to put in a lot of work to give that thing double strike. And then you come around to the next turn and all of a sudden they look over and they're like, why the hell do you have double strike right now? Wait, what? I wanted a couple of ways to give her double strike in this deck. And in mono blue, you are really limited. So, this is what I had to work with. And I'm not going to lie, I was a little upset about that at first. But then once I started playtesting with this card, I really came around on it. But now that we've looked at ways to buff Piper up, make us some more clues, right? Let's look at ways to sacrifice those clues. With this next section, that is all about cards that help us activate our abilities, typically our clues. The first set of cards we're going to look at here is Omen Hawker, the Enigma Jewel, and Vedalken Engineer. Now these just tap down and help to pay for the activation costs of our clues, or other things if we really need to, like equip effects. I mean, these are just really simple, they're pretty solid on curve, especially the Omen Hawker and the Enigma Jewel. And then something notable about the Enigma Jewel is that you can flip it, and on the back side of it, it actually doubles all clue triggers. Now, I've rarely used this in playtesting myself, but it does get pretty nasty when all of a sudden your clues just double up on all their triggers. And then you might also look at this and say, oh man, it's 9 mana to craft and flip this. Like, that sounds like a lot. Well, if you think about it, it's really 7 mana, because you can tap down the Enigma Jewel to help pay for its own craft effect. But let's move on to Grand Architect. It can give all of your blue creatures +1/+1. Any small ways we can buff Piper is definitely welcome. But the main thing on this card is that it turns all of your blue creatures into the Enigma Jewel. So this thing can definitely help you out, especially if you're, feeling like your back is against the wall, you're maybe at a disadvantage. All of a sudden you play this out, you start drawing and digging through your deck by tapping down all your blue creatures, and you start finding answers, and it just, a lot of times it ends up making the deck feel very resilient. Now the next card I want to look at here is Forensic Gadgeteer. So Forensic Gadgeteer says that whenever you cast an artifact spell, you investigate. So we love getting more clues. That's definitely really nice. However, the most important part of this card is that bottom line of text that says activated abilities of artifacts you control cost 1 less to activate. Now it can't reduce this effect to less than 1 mana. All of your clues you have to pay to and sack them? Nah, not anymore. They cost half that. And so all of a sudden you just start sacrificing double the amount of clues per turn, getting double the amount of counters on Piper, and so this thing just, it helps you snowball so much. So I'm going to move on from the Forensic Gadgeteer, and we're going to start talking about the Cryptic Trilobite. This thing is odd, okay? So it's an X spell, it costs XX, and it ETBs with X+1 counters on it. The main thing we're worried about here is removing a +1 counter from him to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. So what this basically means is that what you do is you remove a +1 counter from Cryptic Trilobite, you use that mana to sacrifice a clue. Piper's ability triggers, she puts a +1 counter on Cryptic Trilobite. You can go through all of your clues just at the drop of a hat. Now there's one last card that we're going to talk about that specifically ramps us into our activated abilities. Karn, Legacy Reforged. His power and toughness are each equal to the greatest mana value among artifacts you control. I do really wish that it was equal to the number of artifacts that you control. If that were the case, he could be like a 20-something. Like he could be the legal drinking age. But the important part about this is that at the beginning of your upkeep, you add a colorless mana for each artifact you control. And this mana can't be spent to cast non-artifact spells. It's really solid. We have a lot of activated abilities in this deck, so anything that helps us, activate those abilities, activate those clues, and then even cast artifacts. It's just good, man. Does it need much more explanation than that? So now let's move into some of the ramp that is not specific to activated abilities. So I guess you could call this ramp a bit more conventional. So first off, we have Soul Ring, Sapphire Medallion, and Inspiring Statuary. Soul Ring needs no introduction. Sapphire Medallion, I doubt needs any introduction. All of our blue spells just cost one less. Inspiring Statuary gives all of our non-artifact spells improvise. And I have been looking for a deck to put this card in for forever. And then another random card that I just threw in here for a little bit of explosive ramp is High Tide. Now, High Tide, you pay 1 blue for it, and then the rest of your islands, they tap for double blue. It's mostly in here just because I have never personally played with this card. I've never played High Tide before in a deck, and so I was just kind of excited for it. I wanted to see what it would do. Now, these next couple of cards we're going to talk about here, they are just absolute beasts in the ramp department, at least specifically in this deck. These cards are 500 Year Diary, Urza, High Lord Artificer, and Academy Manufacturer. So 500 Year Diary, it does ETB tapped. In this deck, like, this thing just pops off. As soon as you get around the turn cycle with it, as soon as you get around the board, you're tapping it for like 12 mana at instant speed anytime you want. You can spend that mana on anything you want, but, you know, let's move on to Urza, High Lord Artificer. Some of you probably heard me say his name and you just groaned and rolled your eyes. Okay, I get it, I get it. I'm never going to use his bottom ability, but I do like that he puts a beefy Karn struct on board, and then all of your artifacts tap for a blue mana. That's just really good, man. There's no way around it. I would be limiting the power level of this deck pretty significantly if I wasn't running Urza High Lord Artificer. I need ways to ramp, honestly. And this is one of the best ways to do that. Speaking of Academy Manufacturer, Academy Manufacturer, I mean, this thing is just an auto-include in any deck that runs clues, foods, or treasures. If you're running clues, you're getting extra mana, and then you're also getting the option to gain life. I mean, it opens up so many doors in any of those 3 kinds of decks. In this deck specifically, Academy Manufacturer synergizes really well with some of our alternate win cons. And so, speaking of those alternate win cons, I should probably get into those real quick. First off, we have Cyberdrive Awakener and Rise and Shine. Now, these turn all of our artifacts into some pretty solid bodies, and then you drop them down. You make sure you can end the game when you do so, or, you know, at least get close to where you're in a pretty good position to 1v1 somebody. And then you just, you know, you swing out, you go crazy. Academy Manufacturer goes crazy with these two. And then Rise and Shine goes really well with Herald of the Secret Streams. I promised I'd mention it earlier, and I'm mentioning it now because Rise and Shine puts +1/+1 counters on all of these artifacts, and then Herald of the Secret Streams says, oh, look at that, you got +1/+1 counters on you. How would you like to not be blocked? That sounds nice, doesn't it? If you don't win immediately, you're just doing it wrong. Yeah, somebody could cast a fog effect, I suppose. Or kill the Herald and then block. So maybe you won't be doing it wrong, but you know. But now let's look at another card that can animate our clues specifically in Tangle Trove Kelp. And so every single combat, each single clue you control becomes a 6/6 artifact creature. And then another thing to note too is Senator Peacock, as you may remember, turns all of our artifacts into clues. All of a sudden, you know, all of our artifacts become 6/6 creatures. So you definitely have to be careful when playing this one. If you see the finish line, that's when you want to play this card. You don't want to play it too early and then just get absolutely decimated by a board wipe. Or if you do play it a little bit early, you want to be able to protect it with a counter spell or some sort of, you know, thing like that. Sometimes that can protect your life total, incentivize people to swing at everybody else and not your entire army of 6/6s. And then one more card in here that helps you build a board presence. Put it in my alternate win cons. I'm not sure how much you're going to be winning the game with this, although it can get really out of hand. I'm beating around the bush here. It's Summoning Station. So you can tap it, you put a 2/2 into play, and whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from play, you can untap it. Every time you sacrifice a clue, you create a 2/2 off of it. It's also there to try and punish any other like clue decks, food decks, and treasure decks specifically. It's more of an interesting card that I threw in here just because I wanted to play around with it. Okay, so now let's get into some of our other win cons here. There's two more, and these two specifically revolve around drawing cards. So the first one I'll mention here is Psychosis Crawler. So if you get to a point where you're putting like 20 clues on board, and then you're getting to a point where, you can sacrifice all 20 of those clues at the blink of an eye, Psychosis Crawler becomes a game ender. And even if he's not a game ender, he does a lot of chip damage. A lot of times it's not even chip. It's chunk damage, or life loss, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, I put this card in way too many decks. I love drawing cards. So yeah, I love it. This is one of my favorite cards in the entire game of Magic. Just solid. So now we get into our final alternate win con in this deck in the form of Triskaidekaphile. So the idea here is that you can drop him down, and you usually want to wait until you have enough mana and enough clues to just go through the turn cycle and have 13 cards in your hand. That's usually when I'm like ready to play the Triskaidekaphile. Sometimes I'll play him early though. If people are running a lot of removal and then Piper starts getting scary, well then I'll just drop Triskaidekaphile on board. And a lot of times Triskaidekaphile will take the heat off of Piper and will eat the removal spell instead of Piper eating the removal spell. But anyway, that is all of our alternate win cons. Let's get into some of the other ways we have to draw cards in this deck. So the first couple of cards we're going to look at in this category are Sage of Lat-Nam and Master Thopterist. So these are both alternate ways to sack clues, or any other artifact for that matter, and they can help us continue to dig through our deck while we do so. Now, Master Thopterist, it draws cards on the same rate as just sacrificing a clue, but it is a good way to alternatively sacrifice clues. It basically is kind of a 2-for-1. And then Sage of Lat-Nam, I mean, this guy was in Nam. Just get a free sack and draw a card off of a clue every single turn. But moving on, we get to Secrets of the Key and Thought Monitor. Now, these are just one-off little cards. Secrets of the Key, on curve. You turn 1, you Secrets. You turn 2, you Piper. And then all of a sudden, you have a clue that you can sacrifice before Piper deals her first bit of damage. And so you start the game off with 2 clues instead of 1. It definitely helps get the ball rolling. And then you can flash it back, which is nice too, I suppose. But Thought Monitor here is really solid. You get to turn 4 or 5. And this thing is just a 1 blue mana, draw 2 cards. And then it puts a flying body on board. You can't get much better than that. So next, let's look at some more explosive card draw than what we've seen previously. So we're going to look at Nyssa of Traken, Skyswimmer Koi, Shimmer Dragon, and Universal Surveillance. Now Nyssa, she serves as yet another way to sacrifice a lot of your clues really fast. And then so whenever she attacks, you sacrifice X artifacts, and then she taps down X creatures, so it helps her get through for damage and not have to worry about getting blocked and dying. And then you just draw X cards for each of the artifacts that you sacrifice this way. So, if you attack with her and Piper on board, all of a sudden you can just sacrifice all of your clues, or any other artifact for that matter. Piper gets buffed. It gets real nasty real fast. Moving on though, we've got Skyswimmer Koi here. And Skyswimmer Koi just helps you dig. You play this on turn 4 or 5, and you swing in with Piper. You're looting through like 4 or 5 cards the turn that it comes out, and that just keeps stacking every single turn after that. It is just a really good way to just search through your deck for the exact cards you need. It's such a neat little guy. Look at him. He's a whole koi fish. And then Shimmer Dragon, he's a 6 mana 5/6. With flying, so he definitely helps with protecting our face against flying. And he usually is going to have hexproof, almost always going to have hexproof. And then if you get to a point where you want to keep all your clues on board, you can just tap down 2 of them and draw a card. So this card is definitely really good, especially if you have an animation effect in your hand and you want to keep those clues around to turn turn them into bodies. You know, you can just draw cards. You know, you don't have to sacrifice. You don't have to pay mana for them. You just do it. This guy should be the spokesperson for Nike, because you just do it. Universal Surveillance. It's explosive. It's basically a Whir of Invention, except instead of searching for anything, you draw that many cards. There's not much else to say about this card. It's pretty simple. That's what I love about it. You just draw a bunch. Definitely a good include in here. All right, but that's all of our excess draw in the deck. So let's talk about what artifact you want. We are running a couple of artifact tutor spells. So in this deck, you want to have a couple of things in play for it to be running at the optimal level, and these couple of cards here will help you do that. So first of all, we're going to talk about Trophy Mage. So I purposefully built the deck so that she could grab a multitude of things. She can't grab anything to make Piper unblockable, but she can grab things to buff Piper. She can grab, things to give Piper hexproof. She can grab a Darksteel Plate or a Mithril Coat for indestructible. Or if you need mana, she can grab Academy Manufacturer or Inspiring Statuary. Usually I go for the Manufacturer, but, in case you get to a point in the game where he's already come down and then got killed immediately, as he should, you can grab the Inspiring Statuary instead and, still be doing all right. So Trophy Mage just searches for just about anything you want. However, there are 2 more cards in this deck that can search for literally anything you want and just throw them on the battlefield. And those cards are Whir of Invention and Reshape. They're extra copies of any artifact you want. They put them straight onto the battlefield. Whir of Invention does it at instant speed. And then Reshape, this one's at sorcery speed, but it does cost 1 less to do so. However, Whir of Invention has Improvise. Yeah, they're just both good cards. Alright, so now that we've gone through the ways we can search our artifacts and kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together here, let's look at probably some of the more important pieces of the puzzle, right? Which is your removal, your interaction. Everybody knows you got to eat your green vegetables. So first of all, I'm going to once again mention all of the counter magic. So I'll throw those up here on screen right now, right here. Let's go. Arcane Denial, Counterspell, Negate, Reject Imperfection, Assert Authority, but we're also adding one more counterspell in here, which is Disdainful Stroke. The reason why Disdainful Stroke is in the removal and the interaction section outside of the protection section, oh, that rhymed. It's because of the limitation on it. So usually with Disdainful Stroke's limitation, that means it tends to get saved for beefy creatures or like really huge spells that just end the game. Yeah, a lot of times, unless it's being saved for a board wipe, you're just getting rid of something that costs a lot that's problematic. But let's look at some straight up removal. Mono Blue has Pongify, Rapid Hybridization, and Resculpt. And this will remove any threats that are already on the board. Again, we're in Mono Blue. We have limited options, but these options here, this is the best you got. So next up we have Engulf the Shore, and this is just to bounce a lot of creatures all at once. It's really good against token decks, and notably, if you've put a lot of counters on Piper, usually she will have much more power and toughness than you have islands. So this is just a really good crowd control tool, especially in a mono blue deck. And then one last card in here, it's a bit of a pet card, however I do think it puts in some work, is Junk Winder. So this is used to tap down things as an additional effect when any of our clues enter the battlefield. So you can stifle any creature's use in combat, or you can prevent any creatures from using their activated abilities that require them to tap as part of the cost for an entire turn cycle. Just another solid crowd control tool. So, I say it's a pet card, but the more I talk about it, the more I'm like, I don't know. This card might need to stay in this deck. And then the last thing I want to talk about here is just the utility lands that I put in here. So we have Archway of Innovation. It's basically paying 2 and you can give something improvise. Scene of the Crime. We have that in here for some clue synergy. We have Seat of the Synod in here for some artifact synergy. We have Demolition Field to answer some pesky lands. Ominous Cemetery for some extra removal. Now, I have never seen Ominous Cemetery before I started making this deck. Why is this thing not played more often? It's Chaos Warp for creatures on a land. That sounds really good. For some recursion, we have Abstergo Entertainment, we have Buried Ruin, and Mystic Sanctuary. So Abstergo, it grabs any historic permanent, and then it's also a great graveyard hate card because it exiles all graveyards afterwards. The Buried Ruin grabs any artifact that may have entered your graveyard. And then the Mystic Sanctuary is just another way you want to recur either one of your instants or your sorcery spells. A lot of times, it's good to have an extra bit of removal. We're also running Cathedral of War and Karn's Bastion, and these both just kind of help pump up Piper a bit. A lot of times with the Cathedral of War specifically, Piper is a lot of times attacking by herself. Karn's Bastion, I don't know that this needs any introduction, but in case it does, you basically pay 5 and proliferate. That's really solid. As we've seen before, there are a couple of cards that deal with counters, or if you want to go wide with Piper, you can put +1 counters on all your other creatures. Tyrite Sanctum is also in here for some buff and for a bit of protection. So it takes 2 turn cycles, but if you're not running into any of your protection spells, this doesn't look so bad. And then we'll go through 2 last cards here, which are good for evasion. And one of them is Soaring Sea Cliff. ETB's tapped, gives a creature flying, so it can help Piper get over somebody's board if you need to. And then the last card here is Rogue's Passage. Did you think this wasn't going to be in the deck? Rogue's Passage goes into so many decks, anything that buffs big creatures. A lot of times I have seen games end because somebody played Rogue's Passage in turn 3, and then it comes around to turn 7 or 8, and they swing in and somebody's like, I'm gonna block it, and they're like, no, before blocks, I'm activating Rogue's Passage. It's definitely a sneaky little win sometimes. And then we have the most important card of the deck, and that is an island. And not just one island, 19 of them total. And if you count that with the 13 utility lands and the Hydroelectric Specimen, you get a total of 33 lands altogether. Now, some people say this is a very low number of lands. And look, I get that, I hear you, I see what you're saying. However, towards the early game, a lot of times you don't need more than 3. At least, as long as you can play Piper on curve, you're usually doing pretty alright. This deck, the average mana value is 2.99, and that's not accounting for the fact that, some of the stuff costs less, like the 7-drop counterspell, that's really just 2, and then there's, some ways to very explosively add mana, specifically to activate abilities, add mana that you can use on anything. I have never run into a problem with it. Honestly, I doubt anybody else will, and like I said, this deck is a jumping off point. If you want to add more lands into your version of this deck, by all means, go for it. I do hope you enjoyed this deck. It's really fun. Honestly, like I said before, you pull it out at almost any casual table, and you're just having a good time, man. So yeah, you let me know what you think down below. Let me know what changes you would make to the deck, and then I will be putting the entire deck list down below. If you want to copy paste it, see what you want to do with it. And yeah, if you like the video, please make sure to like and subscribe. That's the quickest way to let me know that you want to see more of this. I might do some more of these, honestly. I'm really thinking about it. I love making commander deck lists. I make more than I have the means to build, so I definitely would not mind sharing some of those with you guys. But yeah, with all that being said, I hope y'all enjoyed, and Kenniron out.